Okay, thank you very much. Do you hear me? Excellent. So welcome to this conference, this Novamigra Budapest International Conference on Populism and Migration. But this event is part of the Novamigra project, sponsored by the European Union. This conference is organized by the John Wesley Theological College. Before we start our procedure, I would like to ask Gábor Iványi, the rector of this college, to have a few words as introductory remarks and address the conference.
Hölgyeim és uraim, tisztelettel köszöntöm Önöket ezen a konferencián.
Ladies and gentlemen, we welcome you to our conference.
Teológus vagyok, és ezért figyelnem kell arra, hogy mit mond ezekről a kérdésekről a Biblia.
I'm a theologist, so I have to pay attention what the Bible says about these issues.
De azért is hivatkozom erre a könyvre, mert Magyarország és annak miniszterelnöke hangsúlyosan is kereszténynek vallja magát, és ezekkel a kérdésekkel, amelyekről Önök itt most tanácskozni fognak, ő is találkozott, gyakorolja ezeket, van hozzá valamilyen viszonya.
The reason why I mentioned this book is because Hungary and the leadership of Hungary, with Orbán Viktor himself, associates himself with Christianity and the Bible, and has some sort of connection with these issues and has a standpoint on them.
A Biblia migrációt az emberi történelem természetes működéséhez tartozónak gondolja.
The Bible considers migration as a natural element of human existence.
Populizmus megveti,
Rejects populism,
menekülőket pedig a szerető figyelmünkbe ajánlja.
and refers to our loving humanity of our immigrants or refugees, rather.
Az elmúlt napokban kényszerültünk megfogalmazni egy nyilatkozatot, ami ma kerül a nyilvánosság elé, amelyben tiltakozunk az ellen, hogy a magyar kormány lezárja a határzónát, és még sanyarúbb helyzetbe kerülnek a migránsok Magyarország határán.
We were forced to formulate a statement these days, and it is going to be published tomorrow, to the effect that we are very sorry to hear that the Hungarian government has closed down the borders, forcing the immigrants and refugees into more hardship.
Kívánok Önöknek jó tanácskozást, és kérem, hogy hagyjanak nekünk itt jó ajánlásokat és bátorítást.
So we welcome you to the conference and hope you'll have an enjoyable time, and please take our friendly demeanor and hospitality with you, and recommend our conference to others.
Köszönöm szépen.
Thank you very much, Gábor Iványi, for this wonderful words of wisdom. We do need these words, and And thank you, Katalin Zotner, for excellent interpretation. I would like to ask my colleague Sophie Gerard-Rotor to say a few words as opening remarks.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Eva, for your welcoming here. Thank you very much to you, Director, for your first word. We are very happy to be there. I just want to say a few words about the project, the larger project within which this conference occurs. So, as you see on this nice poster, we are a member of a project called Novamigra, but it rests on norms and values in the European migration and refugee crisis. And so this project is funded by the European Commission, and it is meant to reflect on what may have happened after the 2015 crisis, when many migrants and refugees arrived in Europe and provoking a kind of uncertainty about the way the European Union should handle this situation, with contrasted reaction, negative reaction of fear of closing of borders, or positive reaction of welcoming culture. And so one of the main purposes of our project is to reflect on what is at stake here by asking the question if the European Union is based on certain values, and it is supposed to be the case given the adoption in 2009 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights in Europe. What has happened to these values or norms after the crisis? So this is the basic question, and we try to address this from different perspectives and from different sub-questions, and populism is one of them. So today we are trying to reflect on this new growing political tendency with various aspects within Europe, and try to see if populism is something that is important in this so-called crisis of value. So thank you very much to all of us to welcome here today. Us is 9 universities involved in this project. So colleagues from Milan, from Duisburg-Essen, from Poznan, from Utrecht, from a Greek team also from Eliamed, colleagues from Sweden, and colleagues from Paris, the team I belong to, and colleagues from Chicago also. So some of us could not come today due to the epidemic situation, and they regret it a lot. So I send their greetings to you. But those of us who can be there are very happy and look forward to the discussion and presentations today. And we really thank your institution to welcome us today. Good conference for all.
Thank you very much for this kind words, Sophie. And now, as the conference is duly opened, we should start our proceedings. I would like to remind you that the whole event is filmed and screened, and we are taking some pictures for internal purposes and for dissemination purposes. Thank you for your permission. And now, I would like to ask our first speaker today, Mr. Peter Krekel, a long-standing friend of mine. And I would like to ask him to deliver his speech on tribal politics and myths on migration and populism. Peter, go ahead.
Hi everyone. Hi everyone.
That works.
Okay. Thank you very much for. I adjusted to my size. Yeah. Thank you. So thank you very much for having me in this conference, and it's a real honor, and it's an important time to discuss important issues that are very urgent in all the countries that are involved in the project. What I'm going to do now is to give a bit of terminological introduction in the topic as I see it. It's something like a thought experiment that I will introduce here. My main argument is going to be that tribalism is a better term in describing political tendencies these days than populism is. And I do think that if we use the term tribalism, then it explains us probably a bit more. about contemporary policies in the Western world that we usually label populism or populist or right-wing populist in terms of demographics and in terms of migration. So what I'm going to talk about, first a bit about what are the problems as I see with the term populism. Second, why I think tribalism is rather a good term. And third, what are the consequences of the term tribalism and how does it apply to policies around immigration and about demographics. So of course, just as a beginning, I'm not going to say that anyone who wrote so far about populism, I of course quote and cite the same kind of academic work than everybody else does on populism, and I think they are thoughtful, and I think there were many important theories on the field. I rather have a problem with the concept. So the three problems, as I see, with the concept of populism is, first of all, that there is, in a lot of cases, a discrepancy between the words and the actions. So if you think about many populists who call themselves populists, and this is also an important thing, that more and more populism is becoming a word that is not a curse word for populists themselves, but a label that they are happy to use on themselves. Because what does it refer to? Even, I think, increasingly in the public imagination, that someone is on the side of the people and not on the side of the elites. This is the self-definition of populists on themselves as well. On the other hand, if we take a look at what usually politicians who we label as populists do, in a lot of cases they do a lot of measures that are more favoring the elites than the people as such. And just to bring one example from Hungary, the Hungarian government, which uses the textbook rhetorical elements of what we usually describe as populism, that I will talk about a bit later. For example, passed a modification of the constitution and then the cardinal laws that makes it more difficult to organize a referendum and make a referendum more valid. So the point here is that we are on the side of the people, we are listening to the will of the people. On the other hand, there are measures that making listening to the will of the people a bit more difficult in a procedural manner. On the other hand, many politicians who describe themselves as populists or describe themselves as popular at least, they make measures that are usually more about collecting resources for their beloved party and the party that they represent, much more than distributing these revenues among the people. Second problem with populism is that in a lot of cases, when we use it, I think it's an understatement. For a lot of time, for example, Vladimir Putin or Erdogan was also labeled as populists. If we take a look at their policies these days, I think it's quite easy to tell that it was at least an understatement. So populism can be a good term that describes their rhetoric. On the other hand, if we take a look at their real actions, it's much more something that goes well beyond the boundaries of democratic decision making, and a certain level of democracy is definitely needed for populists. So populism cannot operate in a strongly authoritarian and even more totalitarian environment. The third problem, what I see, and this is where I will bring some empirical data, is that the voters of the parties that we usually label as populists, and I will come to very close examples, Hungary and Poland. The voters of opposition, of governmental parties in Hungary and Poland voters of parties that are described as populists and rhetorically they are populists do not have populist attitudes. So me as a social psychologist tend to think that if a term in political science has a real meaning, then it has to translate in some way, in some kind of attitudes, in some kind of mindsets. But this is not really the case with the populist parties and the voters of populist parties. Let's see why. So what are the...
Yes, we will take a few seconds as a rest, and kind of break in between, and then it goes well. Thank you.
Okay.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay, so what is populism in a school book definition? It's the two most important elements that all the very diverse set of definitions agree with is people-centrism and anti-elitism. People-centrism, a political position that emphasizes that the statement of the politician is somehow the will of the people, and the major goal of the politician is to express this kind of will of the people, whatever it is. The other point is anti-elitism. So the people and the demos is defined against the elites who have different interests than the people, and the elites are undermining the will of the people and the interest of the people. So if we take a look at these two concepts, and we think that populism is somehow something that exists not just as an abstract term, but a political reality, then we should see them among voters of parties that are on government and are labeled as populists as well. Fidesz and Law and Justice in Poland. So what we can see in the case of the people-centrism in Hungary. We have done a research in 2018, it was representative poll in Hungary and Poland about the attitudes of voters in different parties. And what we found is that Fidesz voters are absolutely not more people-centric in their attitudes. So they did not really agree more with statements such as that the final goal of politics is to represent the will of the people and things like that. We cannot really see too much differences here. The most people-centric party in this set was Jobbik in terms of its voters. If we take a look at anti-elitism, anti-elitism is the lowest in the Fidesz voter base. Yeah, this is it. So this is the lowest in the Fidesz voter base, and even if the differences are not that dramatic, but it's quite obvious from a certain extent that if a party, a populist party, becomes part of the establishment, becomes the government itself, becomes the elite itself, then the classical anti-elitism does not manifest in the same way that the school book theories would suggest. Of course, we can tell that anti-elitism is elevated finally at a different level on the international elites and so on, but still I think it's an important indicator. Also, if we take a look at anti-elitism in Poland, we can see that in the voter base of Law and Justice, there are no higher levels of anti-elitism than in other parties. And if we take a look at other countries where the leadership of the country is usually described as populist, we find similar patterns. In the case of Montenegro, for example, that is described by some as state-sponsored populism with a long history of rule of Milo Đukanović. The most anti, so if we take a look at this is the anti-elite attitudes index, and it's one of the lowest among the voters of Milo Djukanovic. And if we take the case of Serbia, where it's hard to argue that that Alexander Vučić is not a populist, Alexander Vučić's voter base is sharing the least anti-elitist attitudes. So when populists, so-called populists, are becoming governing force, it's hard to find this kind of anti-populist appeal anymore. So I think we can rather argue that this kind of two-component definition of populism, focusing on people-centrism and anti-elitism, it's easy to find it when people are, when parties are in opposition, but not that much when they are on government. And it's quite easy. I mean, quite interesting. Would we think that voter of a populist politician would agree the most that most politicians are trustworthy? Not that much, but the voters of Alexander Vučić agree with this statement the most in Serbia. So we could see many examples from Central Eastern European countries that when populist parties becoming governmental parties, then this attitude in populism does not reflect the thinking of their voter base. So what do I suggest? Rather the concept of political tribalism that has three main components as we defined it and measured it in this study: Manichaean thinking, division of the word to good and evil, and thinking about this very strong binary codes, authoritarian attitudes, which is to a certain extent, many think it's highly connected to populism usually, but in fact, terminologically, it's more like the opposite. I mean, the authoritarianism puts the trust in one strong leader, while populism officially puts the trust in the collectives of people. And the third component is anti-pluralism. An attitude that says that there is only one possible manifestation of the will of the people, therefore anyone else who is against this one-fourth that represents the people is against the people. So if we take a look at Manichaean worldview in Hungary, this thinking about politics in terms of good and evil, there was a question that we asked, that you can tell a person is good or bad if you know their politics. So if he stands on the good side, then he's a good person. If not, he's an evil person. Who were the voters who most agreed with these statements? Voters of the governing party Fidesz, voters of the opposition party Democratic Coalition, which shows that it's not, usually political tribalism has its nature, that it creates tribalism not just in one part of the political spectrum, but elsewhere as well. What can we see about Manichaean worldview in Poland? This thinking about politics in the strong binary codes, war between good and evil. The supporters of law and justice are far the most Manichaean. Anti-pluralism in Hungary is interestingly found to be the highest in the voter base of Democratic Coalition, but here the differences are really minimal. So what we also found is that in Poland and in Hungary, level of authoritarian attitudes are higher in Fidesz voter base and law and justice voter base than elsewhere. And on the other hand, anti-immigration sentiments found to be far the strongest in the voter base of Fidesz, while the baseline is already pretty high, because we know it from studies that that anti-immigration sentiment is more like a common feature of most of the voter parties than something that is very distinctive. But even from this high baseline, Fidesz voters come to the top. So 5 features of political tribalism, as I define that. First of all, the big difference to populism is that I think tribal politics, and usually you see this crude manifestation of tribal politics when this party is becoming governmental force is based on horizontal and not vertical conflicts. Horizontal in the sense that the most important thing is not that we have to fight against the elites, but we have to fight against the other tribes. And if we take a look at some statements of pro-governmental intellectuals, to say so, and their relationship towards corruption, for example, I think it's quite talkative. When the rector of Corvinus University says, for example, that what others call corruption, we call it the rationale of Fidesz governance. It's quite something. What does he mean by that? That he explains that in order that the government keeps away the globalist post-communist forces from power, there is a need to build a national bourgeoisie. And if you want to build a national bourgeoisie, of course you have to select very carefully who are the tenders going for, who will receive the public money, because you have to strengthen your empire. Where is the anti-elitism in this kind of statements? It's more about building national elites. It's more natural than democratic politics, and that's what I think gives the appeal of so-called populists, I would call them tribalists these days, that tribalism is a more natural force of making politics, unfortunately, than democratic politics. So democratic institutions, I'm sad to say that, but they are highly artificial. They are not, they are really new, historically. So if democratic norms are weakening, and the support for democratic norms are weakening, I think this kind of tribal reaction in the political landscape easily appears. Tribalism always needs tribal leaders. So there is no good tribal politics without emblematic leaders. It's more about the circus than about the bread. So contrary to many approaches that try to explain the appeal of far-right, the appeal of populist politics, and the rise of extreme attitudes with mostly economical factors, I think most of the research, or at least most of the research I know, rather support the statement that of course economy matters, but symbolic politics matters much more. So tribal politics is more about identity. And also it's usually tribal politics represents itself as the politics of the loud majority. But as Kasmud likes to say, it's much more the politics of loud minority. What are the consequences of tribalism? Justification of corruption. This is something that I already mentioned. If if politics is finally an eternal war between the good and the evil, then corruption is not just acceptable, it's a moral act, because you need to collect resources for your own tribe in order to defeat the other tribe. Otherwise you won't survive. It's all about survival. Selective norms towards democratic transgressions. This is why in many cases we can find in the polls that voters of tribal parties do not see too much problems about, let's say, occupying independent institutions, or sometimes doing political measures in a questionable way, even legally, because if it's a tribal war, then of course the ultimate goal is to win the tribal war, then any tools are accepted. Tribal demographics, it's quite important. So if everything about maintaining the tribe, then demographics becoming extremely important, and immigration is becoming extremely important. So these are the fundamentals of tribal politics. Fake news can become as an important tribal myth. It changes our perception on reality. Does it really matter if something is true or not, a political narrative? Of course not. What matters if it's efficient or not, if it's effective or not in defeating the other tribe. And tribal politics also sometimes about accepting foreign interference into politics if it helps us. So if it's a real war, why not to accept foreign help if it serves the good purpose. And this is one picture about tribal demographics. I would wanted to show to you. This is leaders of Central Eastern European countries: Alexander Vucic, Andrej Babiš, and Viktor Orban. Countries where demographic indicators are simply horrible, and they all discuss the secret of their success of demographics. And what is missing from this picture, from the first row? Any women. So leaders of the tribe are just telling their women how to give birth to more children, but it's definitely not something that can be easily explained in terms of let's say, modern policy programs, why any women is missing. But if we think about it in tribal terms, it's more easy to explain. Joshua Green has a very good book on tribal politics. Here he says that sex and death are the gas pedals and brakes of tribal growth, and and he explains with this principle why abortion, immigration, gay marriage, and a lot of issues that are extremely heated and debated in the imagination of the populist right and in public debates these days, these are the central elements of politics, because it's all about tribal growth. Will our tribe survive? Will others come into our tribe or not? This is something that is about immigration. So what we could see at the last parliamentary campaign in Hungary, that almost the only message that the governmental media was pushing was about George Soros and immigration, which was quite interesting in the sense that the economic figures were pretty good. Still, messaging was all about migrants, migrant. Migrants are coming, migrants are raping, migrants are taking our women, migrants are killing us. They are coming in big hordes as men to defeat us as warriors, or they come with families to take our land and chase us away. All of these are pretty well fit into tribal imagination. And of course it's not accidental that we can see the same narratives arising in all over the Western world with minuscule variances, which I think refers to that it's something that is deep and ancient, and that's why it can be effective. And yeah, let it be probably the last slide. I see that Richard really agrees with that. So that if tribal politics is about defending our tribe, then of course it justifies a lot of aggressive measures as well to keep away members of other tribes. And for example, what we could see in 2015 at the migration crisis is that Hungary was probably the only state that monopolized the vigilante groups, in the sense that you could apply to be a border hunter to keep away the dangerous migrants from the borders. Then I brought my children to a children concert. Then at a municipal event, there was a recruitment camp of the border hunter group, which is a subgroup of the police that you can apply to if you want. And so it was really moving to see that even they send this message to children. So in short, I think that if we apply the term tribal politics, then probably it's easier to explain the very strong connection between what we call populist right-wing politics and the obsession towards demography and immigration. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Peter Keko, for this wonderful, very interesting, thoughtful lecture. And I hope there are many questions and remarks, but I hope you can save or keep your questions for the discussion period. And now it's my turn to ask our guest speaker, Jean-Yves Camus, to deliver his talk on the identitarian movement in France and Europe. Jean-Yves?
Thank you. A lot of things yet I want to say have already been pointed out by Professor Preco, especially tribal politics and the fact that the extreme right or the far right, populist right, stresses the identity issue far more than actually the situation of the economy. This is where my presentation on the identitarian movement totally fits into what's being said at the moment. First of all, a very quick reminder for those of you who do not know much about French politics. We do have an extreme right party in France, polling between 20 and 30% of the vote at most elections, from the city council election to the presidential election. This party, whose name used to be Front National and had no change into Rassemblement National, which would roughly translate as National Gathering instead of National Front, is of course an anti-immigration party. What's interesting is that from its inception in 1972 until the 2015 migrants crisis, the National Front put the emphasis on two reasons why immigration should be banned. The first reason was that, according to the extreme right, immigration is a burden on the national collectivity, and as we are not able to create jobs, well, it's better to tell those who want to settle in the country that, well, they will not get a job. The slogan, more or less, is "the boat is full," you know, which has been the rationale for most of the extreme right policies in Europe. So, first of all, the boat is full. The second reason was racism. Especially in France, where we had a long colonial history, most migrants coming from North Africa and West Africa were seen as belonging to national or ethnic groups who had no culture or no civilization, or at least who had a culture which was well lower in comparison with French or European culture. So those were the two reasons why this party successfully campaigned on an anti-immigration platform. And then, beginning with the attacks on New York City in 2001, and after the 2015 migrants crisis, a new discourse began to emerge on the extreme right, not only in France but all across Europe. And this is the ideology of the identitarian movement. The identity movement has a very different opinion about why immigrants should not come to France and to Europe. It's not so much about the economy. It's not so much about their supposedly lower ranking culture. It's because immigration is bad not only for the host country, but it's bad for the natives as well, for the immigrants as well. Because, as the identity movement says, each and every ethnic group can only achieve its own national culture if it lives on its own land. So, for example, the identity movement is not like the National Front. They do not say, well, Muslim culture is subnormal. It's not up to the standards of European culture and not up to the standards of Christian culture. What they say is, if you are a good Muslim and you want to achieve your Muslim culture, there's only one possibility. That is that you remain in a Muslim country and you live a 100% Muslim culture. So the fear of ethnic mixing, the fear of, I would say, the fact that so many people from so many countries are now not only spoiling European culture, but spoiling their own culture as well, because they get, I would say, unable to switch to European norms when they live in immigration, is something totally new. And this totally new idea of why immigration should be banned has something to do with the intellectual or so-called intellectual movement that we in France used to call the New Right. The New Right in France with Alain Benoit and many others, the New Right in Germany with Gerd Kubitschek and Junge Freiheit and many others, is a very small movement. It's not about voters, it's about would-be intellectuals who try to influence party politics and public opinion and try to have their ideas become hegemonical and trying to build a narrative of what European and French identity really is. So if you want to understand this change in the extreme right between racism and the fear of race mixing, the fear of ethnic miscegenation, you have to go back to the 1970s and 1980s and go back to how the New Right successfully became a small but influential movement, not only on the extreme right, but all across, I would say, the wider conservative spectrum, including having an influence on people who are politicians affiliated with the mainstream conservative parties. What the New Right was about and what the identity movement is about today is telling European people that they have an history that has been confiscated by the politically correct discourse, and that they need to go back to the real roots of European culture. So what are the roots of European culture really? It's not multiculturalism, it's not democracy, or at least if it is democracy, it is some kind of an authoritarian, illiberal democracy. It's not about race, it's more complex than race. It's cultural belonging, Christian roots but not Christianity. Most of the New Right admits that Europe has Christian roots, but they are not Christians themselves. Many of them are pagans, many of them are non-believers, and they don't care about religion, I would say, as individuals. And three, their claim is that you can be a nationalist, you can be, for example, a French nationalist, but you do not have to focus only on French issues, because what is at stake today is the fate of Europe and the fate of European culture, the fate of European ethnicity. So, for example, while the National Front and Marine Le Pen are totally into French issues and do not care about what's going on elsewhere, do not care about Europe at all, the identity movement says, if you want to be a good nationalist, you have to be, I would say, proud of your, there is no French word for Heimat, but your local identity. You should be a French nationalist, but you should also be a European man, a man who has a sense of belonging to European culture and caring not only about your own country, but about the whole continent. Another important issue that the identity movement brought to the thinking of the extreme right is the fact that today they believe the French and the European population is being replaced by immigrants who do not only come because of war as refugees, or do not only come to Europe as economic refugees seeking a better way of life and wanting to get a job, but what the identity movement says is that immigration is in fact a plot. It is a plot. So we go into conspiracy theories. Immigration is something that was devised and is being implemented by globalist forces, by people who believe in a one-world government and want to erase national identities. And in order to do this, they have devised and are implementing the massive arrival of immigrants, not only because they want to help them in a humanitarian way, but because immigrants are a tool for those multiculturalists to erase national identities. You probably remember, and those of you who have an interest in American politics certainly remember the demo in Charlottesville after President Trump was elected. So you had this crowd of white nationalists and white supremacists shouting, "You will not replace us." And well, my contention is that today, the issue of immigration, as we used to know it in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s on the extreme right, is about the so-called Great Replacement, and not so much about the fact that migrants come here and steal your job and just try to steal the jobs of those French people who are on the dope. It's still important, but it's not the most important issue. The identity movement and most of the extreme right in Europe today is speaking about something which is similar to war. It's a cultural war, but it's a war. It's not about economics anymore. What the identity movement says is that because the European population is being replaced by people with non-European roots, not only will the population change over time, so that in, let's say, 2050 or later or sooner, European white people, will be in the minority and our way of life will totally change. But what they say is that sooner or later, we will have some kind of a civil war being launched either by the immigrant community or by white people who want to resist this wave of immigration and do not see how it is possible to cope politically with immigration, but want to defend themselves. And when I say defend, I mean with weapons against this wave of immigration. So for example, we had 2 years ago members of the identity movement in France going on a border patrol in the Alps mountain. That's something that's probably quite usual here in other countries in Central Europe. But in France it was a huge shock that about 100 youngsters with police-looking uniforms went on a border patrol in the mountains and just arrested immigrants who tried to cross from Italy. They did the job of the state because they believe that the state is corrupt and that the state does not want to stop immigration, and that it is instead the elites want to have more immigrants coming in order to achieve this one world globalist agenda. So they did the job themselves. They did not use weapons, but I mean maybe sometime in the future we will get people who are so angry that they want to oppose immigration with weapons and through civil war. And what's very interesting about the identity movement is that they believe that multicultural society brings to civil war, no matter how strong the state is, no matter what you do, no matter what you're saying, the clash between civilization is so strong that one time or another you cannot solve problems politically, especially through your vote and through political parties. What they believe is that indeed miscegenation, race mixing, brings confrontation between two groups, is that the only issue for the European white people is to rise and, well, do some kind of self-defense and do what the state does not want to do. That is not only stop immigration, but start repatriation. This is the big word today. There are two big words in far-right politics today. This is great replacement and repatriation. Compulsory repatriation of immigrants is something that officially all National Front does not promote anymore. They used to do so in the 1990s. Today, what they say is we have to stop immigration, full stop. But the identity movement goes one step further, and it says we have to start repatriation. They do not tell us how they would do this, but their policy is that at one point you simply have to send all people back to their native countries or home countries, regardless of the fact that they are legal or not. If they are documented, they also have to go away. They will also be repatriated. So it's not only against undocumented immigrants, it's against people who come from non-European countries. They simply have to be repatriated. So at this stage you will tell me, well, you're thinking that you're talking about a very small fringe group, okay? That's true. The identity movement in France is probably no more than 1,000 people, 1,000 activists who are really, under scrutiny from the state authorities and from the anti-terrorist police. But it's not because it is a small group that it does not have any significance. Because what I see in France today is that great replacement and repatriation are items that have become, if not mainstream, at least a very common occurrence with many of the pseudo-intellectuals who are on TV shows every day and spread their anti-immigration ideas and want to influence the conservative right. So we have people like Eric Zemmour, for example, on TV every day, and when I say every day, it's actually every day at 6 o'clock, it's 6 p.m. And this guy, who used to be a mainstream conservative, is not saying we have to stop immigration. He talks about great replacement and repatriation, and he does so with an audience of millions of people, and with the approval of some politicians on the mainstream conservative right who think that the best way to fight the National Front is to use the same kind of